is this house right across the street from us here. This is the Mercer house of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil infamy. Now this house over here was built in 1860 for General Hugh Mercer. General Mercer went on to become a Confederate general during the Civil War. He was present at the First Battle of Manassas. It's also called the Bull Run by some. Manassas was a great victory for the Confederacy, though. Certainly it was not without its hang-ups. There were a number of deserters at Manassas. General Mercer brought 6 Confederate deserters into his tent after the battle and shot them all. See, all throughout the war, General Mercer was sending oodles of money down here to finance the building of this house. This was going to be his big show house after the war. That never happened. See, after the war, like so many of his friends, General Mercer was bankrupted. He didn't have a penny to his name. So despite the fact that this house bears his name, General Mercer never even set foot inside this house. He couldn't afford to live here. And here it seems like the house itself has turned nasty. There's something wrong with this house. It has a rap sheet for sure. Almost every single owner of this house has been a murderer. Now, after General Mercer, in 1902, turn of the century, Dr. and Mrs. Wilder lived in this house. One morning in 1902, 72-year-old Dr. Wilder just decided he'd had enough of poor Mrs. Wilder. So he went into his wife's bedroom. This top left-hand window right here held a pillow over his wife's face as she lay there, peacefully asleep in her bed, smothered her and killed her, walked into his own bedroom next door, poured himself a drink, walked out onto the balcony and took a nice fresh breath of the morning air. I guess he was unfazed that he just snuffed out his own dear wife of 50 years. But later that same afternoon, Dr. Wilder was found on the sidewalk beneath that balcony, dead from a fall. And we do not know, to this day, 110 years later, remains a mystery. Did Dr. Wilder jump, slip, or maybe it didn't take too long for Mrs. Wilder to come back and get hers, eh? Years and years after that, in 1969, this house was owned by the Shriners. So they operated this place as their alley, temple, and bar, believe it or not. So, 6 nights a week, the Shriners would be in here, drinking, partying, riding their scooters too, I don't know. On Sundays, this place was closed. So on Sundays, local kids from in and around the Monterey Square neighborhood here used to sneak inside and vandalize and just explore and be kids. 2 kids did this every Sunday. Tommy Downs and his best friend Richard, these 2 11-year-old boys. Every Sunday, without fail, they'd sneak inside and just raise hell. And one Sunday afternoon, Tommy and Richard got a hold of a couple slingshots. They decided they were going to get up on top of the roof and they were going to shoot at pigeons with their slingshots. So they get up there, they're having a little pigeon hunt. And at one point, Richard turns around just to look at his friend Tommy, smile, laugh, embrace all the fun he's having with his good friend. But he turns around and it looks like something which he can't see was pushing Tommy farther and farther backwards on this roof. Some invisible presence. But surely that can't be the case. Tommy's just trying to get a rise out of his friend. Tommy's just trying to make it look dramatic, like he's being pushed. Richard calls out to Tommy and he says, "All right, enough, you've had your fun." Tommy doesn't respond though. Tommy has a real look of fear and panic on his face. It's as though he's trying to say something, but he can't. All the while, he's choking on his own words, moving farther and farther backwards on this roof. Richard realizes something is happening here beyond Tommy's control. He reaches out to try and steady his friend. But again, something, some presence, some force unseen comes between the boys, holds Richard back. He can't even get within an arm's reach of Tommy. He has to stand there defenseless and watch whatever this invisible thing is hurls Tommy right off this roof before his eyes. And you can see all the way around this house there's a black wrought iron fence. Tommy goes tumbling off the south side of the roof. From the back of his neck through to the crown of his skull was completely impaled by one of those metal spikes, skewering and killing him. Later that same year, still 1969, this house was bought by Jim Williams. And Jim was one of the title characters from that whole Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil story, if you're familiar with it. Big art and antiques dealer, but better known nowadays as a historic preservationist. See, Jim moved into Savannah 30, 40 years ago when it was a real dump and fixed these places up and restored them and then turned around and sold them to people who took care of them. That's really why Savannah looks like this now. They said Jim restored Savannah's charm. And certainly he did restore over 50 houses here. I think nowadays we just say Jim was house flipping, don't we? Now at the same time that Jim lived here and worked here and entertained here, he had working for him a young handyman, a guy named Danny Hansford. Now at the time that we meet Danny and listen to the story, he's 21 years old. Despite his young age, very volatile. Heavy drinker. He'll do any drug he can get his hands on. Jim is always having to bail Danny out of jail. It's always chaos between these 2 guys. And Danny's the sort of guy where if he and Jim got into a big fight and it coincided with one of Jim's big parties, Danny would come right out here into Monterey Square, rev up his Camaro, and rip it around the square as loud and as fast as he could, just to piss off Jim and his guests. That's the kind of guy Danny was. There was always trouble when he couldn't get his way. After all the trouble that Danny had caused, one afternoon in 1981, Danny Hansford's body was found lying face down, shot dead, on the floor of the study of this house. The study is the room to our bottom left here. Now, according to Jim, Danny came into the study that afternoon drunk, angry, belligerent, waving a gun, claiming he's going to shoot and kill Jim. Danny fired off a few shots, missed Jim. So Jim said in self-defense he had no choice but to reach into his own desk drawer, pull out his pistol, and shoot Danny, only to save his own skin. Most of us doubt that's how it really went down, though. See, Savannah's a city filled to the brim with open secrets. Oftentimes we know things here, we just don't like to talk about things here. It seems to be the Savannah way more often than not. One very, very open secret of the time was that Jim and Danny had something of a more intimate relationship. It seems as though Danny was a handyman in more than one way, if you catch my drift. And it's believed Jim was just sick and tired of him. He was sick of the drunkenness and the anger and the belligerence, and deciding shooting him and killing him was just as good a way as any to get rid of him. Whatever the case, Jim was brought to trial. Throughout the 80s, Jim was tried 4 times. Then in 1990, miraculously, Jim was acquitted. So in 1990, Jim moves back home, as though this were all just a bad dream. Starts planning his next big Christmas party, even sends out invitations. No big deal. But no less than 6 months after having moved back into this house, one afternoon in 1990, it was Jim Williams himself who was found lying face down, dead, on the floor of that same study, in the exact same place he would have been found had those bullets, whosever they were, hit him all those years before. See, for years and years, Jim was an ardent practitioner of root magic. He would go up to South Carolina across the border, and he sought the assistance from this pretty famous Gullah root doctor, a woman named Valerie Bones. If you're familiar with the book or film, you might know of her the name Minerva. Her real name was Valerie, though. She actually died just a couple years ago. Now, Jim was seeking Valerie's assistance for obvious reasons. He wanted to get acquitted. He wanted his business with Danny over with. He wanted this whole mess behind him. So he went to Valerie, and she worked the root to make it so. Jim got exactly what he wanted. But see, towards the end, Jim started to get a little cocky. He thought that by working with Valerie all these years, he could call himself a root doctor. So in the end, after all that Valerie had given him, after all Valerie had done for him, in the end, in 1990, after getting exactly what it was he wanted, Jim simply decided not to pay Valerie. For 3 days before Jim's death, the eyes and ears of Monterey Square, that's the maids, the nannies, the hired help, people who really see things and know things, they saw Valerie come right up to this house and let herself into the front door as if she owned the place. They said she then walked around downstairs and performed what looked like a series of rituals. She did this for 3 days, and then finally she was leaving this house, walking out here into the square. Jim came to the front door to get the mail. No idea Valerie had been inside at all. He saw her walking away from his house. Suddenly he turned white as a sheet, terrified, slammed the door behind him. The very next day, Jim was found dead. But I can tell you the Gullah people have a legend. They say if a root doctor kills you, if root magic does you in, they say you are forever damned to walk this earth, trapped between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. Many people think that's where Jim still is, stranded between worlds, right here in his own house. We didn't used to include this house in the tour, though. We used to think that the Mercer house is a wee bit overdone. It's a big tourist hotspot. But our interest was rekindled here a while ago. Our tour company founder had a bizarre encounter involving this house. Our tour company founder had finished a tour, he was headed back home, and he walked by Colonial Park Cemetery. 3 ladies were standing just outside the cemetery, and as he walked by, one of them tapped him on the shoulder, and she said, "Excuse me, sir, do you know about that place called the Mercer House?" They told him something he'd never heard before. They said, "That was our little brother Tommy Downs, killed up on that roof in 1969. They said, "If you can find a cab driver in town, a guy named Richard," he was the other little boy up there with Tommy, "he can tell you some stories that'll make your hair stand up straight." So now curious, our tour company founder went home. He got a hold of this Richard. Richard still drives cabs here in Savannah, but he didn't want to talk about it. Richard said whatever it is inside this house is something so truly terrifying. He won't bring a cab fare near this house, even now. Now take note, it's all along that side of the house where all these things have taken place. You know, it's on this left-hand south side where Mrs. Wilder was smothered, where Dr. Wilder fell from the balcony, Tommy fell from the roof, Danny was found shot, where Jim was found dead, all and only on that left-hand south side. What it is about that side of the house where there was something so awfully wrong, I can't rightly say. This spike right here It's the only one not all the way intact. That's because it was from this spike in 1969 Tommy Downs met his end on. The rest of this spike right here was still lodged in the base of his skull. But whether you're a believer or a skeptic or what have you, it seems like Tommy's death has defied the laws of physics altogether, doesn't it? Tell me, where do you think you'd end up if something pushed you off that roof?
Outside
Sidewalk on the curb? It's not what happened with Tommy. Not only was he skewered on this fence, his body was fished out of this ravine down here. How it happens that Tommy managed to fall backwards, I can't really say. But it is bizarre. You can still find that 1969 news article. It discussed how seemingly impossible Tommy's death was. Also included a nice little diagram of his fall. But to make matters even more complicated and weird, in 1969, these trees weren't even here. So it's not even as though in mid-fall Tommy hit something and bounced back. He quite clearly fell backwards. I can't explain that to you.